Hi, welcome to session two of the eighth topic of the semester, Texas during crisis and reforms from 1890 to 1939. All right, so in this topic, we're really looking at, again, a period of time in Texas history in which there's going to be a series of crises. Texas society was in transition. It was transitioning towards modern industrial society. So there was significant radical change taking place in the state in terms of the way how people live. People are migrating to cities because it is in the cities where we're going to find now new enterprises such as manufacturing plants and industries. So that's also something new. We're going to see the rise of industrial capitalism as well, this new economic system that introduced the factory system, manufacturing plants, industries, along with a wage labor system as well. Wages, people are going to now be hired again in those industries to earn wages. And so as people are really changing, again, the way people live in the past, again, that is pretty much, that era is coming to an end, and they're now moving into a whole new setting. The industrial cities, working in factories, earning wages. There's going to be, of course, migrations taking place into those cities, more and more people coming from out of state and out of the country, moving into Texas as well. That all of those changes are going to create anxieties, are going to create a certain sense of insecurity for a lot of people because the process of adaptation was not an easy one. As people are trying to adapt to this new reality, to this industrial capitalist society in which people are now working in factories, earning wages, and farmers are also trying to modernize their farms in order to grow cash crops for the market. They're moving into business. Again, what we're going to see is that Texas society, particularly the traditional sectors of society, like farmers, for example, are going to experience a certain sense of dislocation. That gave them the sense that either they couldn't adapt to this new reality, or in many cases face a lot of challenges in terms of succeeding in this new capitalist economy. As they're trying to modernize their farms, in many cases they were not all the time. Again, there was a substantial number of farmers that did not really succeed in transitioning towards this new mode of production, this more commercial oriented, more industrial oriented mode of production, in which farmers were now producing massive quantities for the market. Okay, so what we're going to see is, again, moments of crises that led to reform movements. And so in session one, we were really talking about the end of the 19th century. The changes that Texas was going through as it's really entering this modern era, and how certain social groups, certain sectors of society will be challenged. They face significant challenges really entering this modern era and succeeding and experiencing, of course, the benefits of living in a modern economy, such as farmers and industrial workers. We were looking particularly at farmers and industrial workers, some of the problems they faced as they were trying to adapt to this new reality, acquire modern machinery, acquire loans in order to get the very expensive machinery. In many cases, they have to place their farms on a mortgage. And many of them were unable to really pay back the loan, so they lost their farms and they became what is called tenant farmers. This was a very pervasive situation in the state of Texas. Railroad rates were elevated as well, very pricey. There was a middleman, that they have to deal with as well, that wanted also a cut, from the price of the grain as well. And we see also that the gold standard also limited farmers' ability to really, again, acquire credit. In many cases, credit was not available because of the gold standard. So that was another issue, that the money supply was constricted in the country because of the gold standard. And of course, natural calamities like droughts also affected the countryside agricultural production. So again, there's a series of issues again that affected farmers that led farmers to organize and create their own associations, like the Grange, for example, the Texas Farmers Alliance, and so on. People are coming together for mutual support mutual help, mutual assistance, and they're trying to bring about reforms in the political system, in the political order, and the economic system as well, of the state. Okay, so we were looking at that all in session one, and also, of course, workers as well. The industrial working class is also, again, another group that is also facing significant challenges as they're transitioning now into this new reality, this new economy. There's long hours, 12 to 14 hours they have to work, worsening conditions inside of the factories, unventilated areas, for example. There were no safety guidelines or measures implemented in those industries. No minimum wage laws, for example, as well. Those were the typical issues that they faced. So they wanted to bring about reform as well. Okay, so they also created their own movement called the labor movement, just like farmers created their own agrarian movement by forming associations. Industrial workers are going to move in this direction as well. And they also created, again, associations like the Knights of Labor, for example. Okay, so we were looking at that as well, how people are forming unions and now coming together under a larger association, again, like the Knights of Labor, that was just seeking to reform, again, the economy, reform industry to better the lives of the worker at the workplace, but also the living conditions, the living standards, again, of workers as well. And at some point, I mentioned in session one that they're going to join forces. The farmers, the agrarian movement, and the labor movement are going to join forces in the early 1890s and form a third political party, the People's Party, which was actually born in Omaha, Nebraska, by the way. Again, this was a national, party that it had, of course, a presence in Texas. The left wing of the Democratic Party pretty much left the Democratic Party in Texas and joined the populist. Those were the most progressive, the most liberal left wing, if you will, of the Democratic Party that really wanted true change, true reform to take place. Because the Democratic Party in Texas had become pretty much accommodated to the big business, if you will, interest. The railroads, insurance companies, lumber industries, and the like. So they were not really creating significant change again in the state. So we're going to see that part of the Democratic Party is going to leave and form again the Populist Party. And of course, they were really trying to push for a series of changes here. Now let's turn to our outline here. Okay, so we were talking. I'm not going to repeat myself. They were seeking economic reforms. The third party, the People's Party, the Populist Party, like silver currency. They wanted to abolish the national banking system, for example. They wanted confiscation of railroad land grants as well. They wanted to a sub-treasury plan, that is, warehouses to store their grain and control it, to withhold it from the market, to establish their own prices, for example. A graduated income tax, tax people based on income, so those that earn more will pay more taxes, and of course an 8-hour working day and shorter work week. So those were economic reforms that they believe was going to better the life of people in general, People's Party, that is to say, the life of workers, the life of farmers, and the like. And there were political reforms that we talked about, like the secret ballot. They wanted voting to be secret, so people would vote for the candidate of their choice, not to be forced, not to be coerced or pressured to vote for the official candidate of their state or locality. That you had to vote Democrat, for example, in Texas. Otherwise, there will be consequences. Okay, so if the People's Party is going to have any chances again of winning elections, people will have to have a total privacy when they're voting. Okay, so they can feel free to vote for whoever they want. Of course, also senators needed to be elected according to the People's Party directly by the people. Instead of senators being chosen by the states, they wanted the senators, the upper chamber of Congress. This is very important, the Senate. This is the gatekeeper, if you will, because all legislation has to be finally approved by the Senate. So how can you bring about reform in the system when the Senate is actually chosen by the states. And if your state happen to be Republican or Democrat, then the Senate is going to be controlled by the two-party system. So the populist reforms, the People's Party reforms, will never have a chance, if there's no populist senators, from the People's Party. So they want senators to be elected by the people directly, not to be elected by the states. Okay, so we were talking about initiative and referendum. I explained all of that again in session 1. So this is a party that really is going to make some gains in Texas, is going to really gain some seats, because one of the appeals, besides that it had really popular propositions that benefit people, by the way. Again, this was a grassroots kind of movement that tried to really bring people together based on class. So therefore, they're going to appeal to the lower classes, so to speak, of society, regardless of race. In other words, that race is not going to be important. In fact, race only divides the lower class. So this is a very racially inclusive party. So it appealed to both whites, African Americans, Mexicans, again, all ethnicities. Okay, it was racially inclusive because that's precisely the kind of movement that it was trying to build in Texas. In Texas, there were already 200,000 members in the early 1890s, 1892, 1893. We're going to see now about 200,000 members. That by 1894, the People's Party gained 22 seats in the state house and also 2 senators in the state Senate as well. So we're talking about state level. In the state, in Austin, of course, what we're going to see is that in the House of Representatives, in the state Congress, there were already 22 representatives in the House from the People's Party and 2 members of the party in the Senate. So they were making some gains, again, very gradual, if you will, but they were pretty moving forward. So now the end of the populist movement really occurred because there were, of course, significant challenges that the party faced nationwide, but also statewide as well. Okay, so because it was a third party, it was actually challenging, the two-party system in the United States. It was challenging the two-party system in Texas as well. Okay, so traditionally, the United States has always been pretty much a two-party system. So in the state of Texas, Democrats and Republicans alike, okay, are going to attack the populists, in a very significant way, portraying the populists as anarchists, for example, communists, and pro-black reconstructionists as well. Particularly the Democrats. The Democrats were pretty much exploiting racial divides and racial anxieties in Texas by promoting the idea that the populists, because they were reaching out to the African American population, that they were going to implement policies that radical Republicans tried to implement back in Reconstruction, of racial equality, for example. Okay, empowering the African American population, again, politically, economically, so they can be in an equal footing with the white population. So because this is a democratic state, again, and the Democratic Party is in Texas really the party of the South. This is the party of the ex-Confederacy, and that really continues many of the ideas of the previous Confederacy that seceded from the Union. Those ideas, this attack on the populists is going to really prevent the populists from gaining more and more followers, because, again, people began to develop a negative view of the populist. Okay. And of course, other issues that other forms of attack by the two-party system in Texas was voter intimidation, fraud, and violence as well. So because the People's Party represented competition, The two main parties in Texas were trying to prevent people from voting, for example, or pretty much controlling elections again in several counties, or you just driving people out of the voting booth again from the poll places again by using violence, for example. Okay, it was quite common. So the People's Party had enormous difficulties in the state of Texas, that they're not going to grow more than what it already was. Trying to gain just a few seats in Congress, having about 200,000 members in the state, and really one of the causes for the end of the Populist Party, besides again the two-party system pretty much working together to contain it, was the presidential election of 1896. Historians look back and, they really see that this presidential election of 1896 was really the turning point in the People's Party, in which the outcome of this election is going to cause the party to start dwindling and disappearing. That by the turn of the century, by 1900, the People's Party had pretty much disappeared. Okay, because the People's Party actually formed an alliance with the Democratic Party in this presidential election. Again, they nominated the Democrat William Jennings Bryan. He was actually a farmer from Nebraska, and so he was very connected to the agrarian movement. But William Jennings Bryan is not going to incorporate the ideals, the objectives of the People's Party, except one single issue, that is free silver. He ran on the campaign to create silver money, silver dollars. It was called free silver. And he rejected pretty much the other proposals that the People's Party implemented or sought to accomplish nationwide and also in Texas, like the sub-treasury plan, for example. Farmers controlling their own product, farmers controlling their own grain, withholding it. He was against it. So he was not really fully committed, if you will, to the People's Party's ideas. And because of that, because he only ran on something like free silver, that was a campaign slogan that did not really connected with the middle class of the United States. The middle class is not going to connect with William Jennings Bryan, even though he's running under a joint ticket. He's really representing the Democratic Party along with the Populist Party. He's going to lose the election. Again, he's going to lose the election. He lost the election, in 1896 to the Republican McKinley, who reached out to the middle class. And of course, he was more appealing to the middle class, the Republican candidate. So the fact that William Jennings Bryan lost the election, and after that, he pretty much quit the People's Party. He quit the populist movement, which was actually really the most obvious leader to continue it. William Jennings Bryan, if he would have continued really organizing people and campaigning, even though he lost the election of 1896, he could have, if he wanted to, he could have run again in 1900 and perhaps had a greater chance for success in 1900. But the fact that he quit politics, that caused the People's Party to pretty much lose leadership, if you will, started to dwindle and disappear. Okay. And so again, this is very important because in Texas, the People's Party is also disappearing. And again, after 1896, there's a return to economic stability in Texas. And so because things got a little bit better, not that they were totally, the problems of the countryside and workers were already solved. They were not, but there's relative economic stability returning to Texas. So therefore, the Populist Party is going to kind of lose its appeal, and the populists are going to go back to the Democratic Party. They rejoined the Democratic Party, whereas others decided to join another party that was on the rise in the United States at this time, which was the Socialist Party. Okay, so again, this is really, again, as far as the People's Party went in Texas in terms of just rising up, presenting, a series of ideas to society, trying to gain seats in the state Congress, and running for, again, for the presidential election, trying to gain the presidency in 1896, supporting the candidate William Jennings Bryan that lost the election. But nonetheless, again, this is something that Texas is going through. Again, Texas is experiencing, again, a populist uprising. We can see that was actually conformed by farmers and workers, particularly, that were desperate pretty much to find solutions to the problems that affected them. So again, there's not going to be a major accomplishment per se that we can say, oh, the People's Party was able to actually create significant reforms in 1890 in Texas. But I should say, one of the greatest contributions of the People's Party, or the populist uprising, again, that we just covered in part one, is that it actually inspired now the second popular uprising, a popular reform movement that was known as the Progressive Era, the Progressive Reform Movement in the United States, but as well in Texas as well. Texas is going to also, again, see the rise of the Progressive Movement that was largely inspired by the populists of the 1890s. But now what we're going to see again in part two is now looking at Texas in the years between 1900 to 1920 to look at what was really going on in Texas that caused people to join now the progressive movement, which some historians just see that like a second wave, again, of reform. Again, this is the age of reform, by the way, that we're looking at. The first wave was the populist, reform movement, and the second wave was the progressive era that followed in the timeline, now moving into the 20th century from 1900 to 1920. So we have to then understand what Texas was going through around this time that moved people to now join the progressive reform movement. We have to look again at the background, what was really going on again in the Texas state. So what we see in those 20-year periods again is that Texas society was in crisis. Once again, just like we see crisis in the past, farmers and industrial workers were going through their own crises, okay, and they tried to address it by forming their own associations, launching their own movements, and joining forces to create a third party. Here, what we're going to see is that in Texas, people are going to experience a series of difficulties or problems, again, as the society as a whole, that led people to think that reform was essential, that it was vital, it was necessary for actually bringing about a more positive society, a more progressive, let me just reframe it that way, a more progressive society in which people were going to progress again in the economic system, in the political system, and the like. So let us look at what was really going in Texas so we can actually see what was really troubling people back during this time. So let's start with number one, political corruption. Okay, political corruption, first and foremost. Sorry for that. Okay, so political corruption. First and foremost, political corruption. Okay, so they see, as I mentioned, that the Democratic Party, again, in Texas is dominant. Okay, and it has been dominant ever since the end of Reconstruction, by the way. Okay, so this is a kind of a one-party state, okay, in Texas, particularly because the Republican Party was associated with the Union, Of course, this is the party that waged war, if you will, during the Civil War, fought the South, and so on. So it is in the South that not only Texas, but all of the southern states that were part of the Confederacy in the past are going to now be dominated by the Democratic Party that tried to preserve the way of life, the values, the traditions of the past. Is the traditional party, okay? The traditional party of Southern culture and society. So it is dominant in Texas. It is, okay? But what we see is that after Reconstruction, the Democratic Party had pretty much resorted to certain practices or mechanisms that were making sure that elections, for example, and even the candidates that were chosen to run in those elections were pretty much chosen by bosses, okay, political bosses. And in many cases, those political bosses had certain affiliations and connections to big business, okay, special interest groups, that is to say. So again, this is something that in Texas people experience. They can witness, again, political corruption in that sense, in that, yeah, there's a Democratic Party, but almost in every county, in every city, in every town, there's a political boss. He belongs to the party, to the Democratic Party, and he's running a machine. A machine is an organization, okay? A political machine, okay, is really an organization that the political boss administers. The political boss is running a machine, is, again, affiliates or people that work for the boss in order to ensure the continuity of the party in that city where the boss actually is in control. So the political boss is not the mayor. Okay, the political boss is like the strong man. Again, he is the leader of the party in that city that is making all the important decisions. He's selecting the candidates that are going to be the mayors or the members of the city council, for example. He's the one selecting all of that. And even though there's an election, even the outcomes of the elections are, in many cases, manipulated by the machinery. The people that work for the boss are the ones actually making sure that the Democratic candidates are always, again, winning, in other words, to prevent the Republicans from winning. Okay. Again, in the beginning, it all started like that. Well, we need to prevent Republicans from seizing power here, so it is important that we ensure that the Democrats continue in office. But as I mentioned, over time, as time proceeded, by the 1880s, 1890s, people perceived that the political bosses were appointing people that were going to favor more big business other than the people, in other words. Okay, so that corruption. So, appointing candidates, and of course, one of the ways that the political bosses ensure that there's going to be the candidate that they selected, that they will win, is by supervising elections. In other words, that if you send supervisors, to the voting place, back then voting was not private. It was not secret. Okay. The secret ballot, again, no, they didn't exist. It's just that, again, you come into the voting place, you were being given the ballot, and there were observers, all around, and they will observe you who you voted for. And so those observers, if you will, or supervisors, will inform the political boss of who voted in favor or against the official candidate, of course. And in many cases, there were, consequences of not voting for the official candidate in your city. So that really created, again, a sense of pressure or coercion, among the voters, that they needed to vote for the specific candidate as well. Okay. Now, in other situations, of course, there were political figures that were not part of the Democratic Party. Okay. Then, for example, there were Republican, figures. There were strongmen, if you will, that were trying to also build more and more support in Texas for the Republican Party. And the way they were trying to do that is by using something called clientelism. Okay, clientelism. Again, so what is clientelism? Okay, so clientelism is that, well, what Republicans are trying to do, because they don't have the control of the state, they're not in power, but they want to build a large base of support, a large popular base, is that they were actually appealing to African Americans who, in Texas, by the way, African Americans back during this time were Republicans. They favored the Republican Party because this is the party of Lincoln. They said, this is the party that freed the slaves, in other words. So by default, again, African Americans voted Republican. So clientelism, again, was a strategy used by Republican figures, strongmen, for example, leaders of the Republican Party in Texas, in which they appealed, to African Americans and actually offer them, certain benefits. In other words, look, if you vote for us, we guarantee that we're going to give you something back. In other words, we're going to give you land. We're going to guarantee that you're going to have a job, or they will just give you money or whatever it is, like clients. In other words, look, you support me and you become my client. I'll pay you for the service of support. In other words, this support is not going to be free. If you support me, just like a client, again, I'll pay you for that service. In other words, the service of supporting me, for voting for me, and you receive something back. In other words, some form of benefit. Okay. And of course, people saw that as corruption because what they said is that, well, people are not going to vote for the most competent candidate, for the wiser candidate that is going to create good laws for society, but rather that they're just pretty much selling themselves to voters and trying to gain votes by offering something, some benefits, etc. They were using clientelism. This is called clientelism, in other words, in politics, and people see that as a form of corruption. Because it's all based on self-interest, by the way. It's not based on, what kind of propositions, what kind of laws you want to implement, but rather, what are you going to give me back? In other words, if I vote for you. And so the other, of course, group that also was reached by the Republican strongmen were the populist poor whites as well. Whether there were Republicans or they were populist from the Populist Party, because the Populist Party was also present in the 1890s. What they are also doing is that they're also trying to gain the support of poor whites, many of whom were actually populist. They wanted true change, true reform, and they were also, part of the clientage, if you will. They were part of the clients of those politicians that were also trying to promise something to a population that was desperate, if you will. Desperate for change, desperate for benefits, desperate for something in return because of their precarious economic situation. They were poor, etc. And here comes again a political figure pretty much offering you something. And again, there was certain mistrust again on those type of practices that were very common now in the state of Texas. Okay, political bosses, machines trying to appoint candidates, supervise elections sometimes, and making sure that the Democrats will come into office by all means, but also again the opponents of the Democratic Party, like the Republicans and the populists, using clientage or clientelism again in order to win votes. Again, so this is something very pervasive, by the way. Okay, this is something rather pervasive in the state of Texas. This is the way people are doing politics. They have become like the normal, in other words. And according to a good number of people in Texas, quite conservatives, again, this was not really something that will create the ideal democratic society, because people are simply going to elect figures that are going to simply give you something, in other words, even though they're not going to be wise in leading the state. And of course, another issue of this political corruption is the fact that the political bosses, in many cases, control saloons. Saloons are like like bars or taverns in which people drink alcohol, and there's gambling taking place and prostitution as well. Okay, they were common in Texas, this saloons. Okay, and there's of course heavy drinking. There's alcoholism now, of course, and people see that because the political bosses, in many cases, they're the ones actually that own the saloons, and they control the sales of alcohol, and that this was part of this corruption. In other words, that the people that were controlling the political machine in the state of Texas were at the same time pretty much in control of this social ill, the social corruption, promoting things like gambling, prostitution, alcoholism, violence, etc. And this was part of the problem as well, that people saw that we are indeed faced with a situation in which we see society disintegrating. Okay, now let's look at another issue of the political corruption. Okay, besides the politics that we just explained, the political bosses and the political machines, the other aspect of this political corruption that also was present in Texas, people witness directly, was the prison systems. Okay, prison systems were part of a network, if you will, of interests that connected political parties with special interest groups, if you will, in which they're coming together and exploit what is called prison labor. Okay, so the prison systems, which were supposed to be, again, centers for actually disciplining or punishing, if you will, people that committed crime, in terms of imprisoning them there to serve, sentences, long sentences and the like. Instead of being that, what we're going to see in the end of the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that the prison systems were now used for actually contracting or leasing labor, okay, to industries or enterprises that wanted cheap labor. So instead of hiring, workers to pay them wages, okay, you have a manufacturing plant, or you're a railroad company, you need to build a railroad, you have a mine, you need to employ people there to work in the mine. So instead of doing that, in order to cut expenses, you wanted to, cheap labor, you go to a prison, okay? And the prison warden, in many cases, was somebody appointed by the local official, by the city boss, okay? And so that person will just write a contract, okay? Say, look, I have 100 prisoners here. I can rent, okay, 100 prisoners to you so they can work in your industry, etc., do this kind of work for this period of time, and you pay me, okay? Yeah, the prison warden is gonna get paid for renting out, again, this labor. Contract lease system, it was called. It was rampant in the state of Texas, by the way. Prisoners were really overworked in the prisons and in the places that they worked. Sometimes manufacturing plants, building railroads and the like. They were underfed, poorly clothed. The conditions inside of the prisons were unsanitary. Of course, there was going to see, microbes and germs, of course, rampant as well in the prison systems. There was, of course, the issue of physical punishment as well, that was allowed back during this time. And another issue of the prison system was the lack of sex segregation, meaning that men and women were pretty much placed in the same, complex. And so in many cases, there's reports of things like sexual abuse, harassment, rape, and the like. This is something that people saw as part of this corruption. That, yeah, of course, this is an institution that is, part of this corruption, in other words, because prisoners are simply used for cheap labor, in other words, and so they're not really well taken care of, in other words. Okay, so people wanted some form of change to take place. So now let's look at another issue that Texas was facing in the first decades of the 20th century, and that is social dislocation and disintegration. Okay, you know, people in Texas felt that the society, okay, was changing dramatically. That the ways of the past, the way people lived in small communities in which people knew each other, by name, etc. They were very traditional, very conservative in their manners and their norms. That all of that ideal existence that they believed was ideal, by the way, they romanticized about this agrarian past, in other words, that this was disintegrating before their eyes, because there were, of course, massive amounts of people migrating from the rural areas of Texas to the cities. Rural are, of course, farming communities. From the farming communities, from the farming towns, people are now living in great numbers to the industrial cities in search for work, okay? To get a job, in other words. People see the city as the source of employment. This is where you're going to make a living, get cash, and so on. Live in a different, in a different form. And again, as people are living, of course, we're going to see that led to the abandonment of communities. So people are seeing family members and relatives leave for the city, never to be seen again in many cases. So there's a certain sense of nostalgia that people feel about that. But one of the issues, again, that people feel, particularly conservative Texans, is that many of the families were broken up in this process. The breaking up of traditional families, for example, because sometimes the father will have to leave because the father was experiencing difficulties growing crops. He was facing bankruptcy, etc. So they'll have to send, either the father will have to go to the city to get a job to sustain the family back home, or one of the siblings will have to go as well to the cities, etc. And so the traditional families are breaking up. Again, this conservative setting is disintegrated because, again, people were, in many cases, forced to migrate to the cities. Okay, so traditional families, again, are breaking up. That creates a sense of anxiety, by the way. Dislocation. People are dislocated. They're dislocated from their, the world that they know, from the society that was so comfortable, so secure. Again, they feel totally dislocated in the world now. And of course, people see that in the cities like Dallas, Fort Worth, for example, San Antonio, Houston, that the way people live there, okay, is that they're giving themselves license to behave in ways that were not appropriate. Okay, and the loose morals of the cities, they will say. People that actually live in cities, they're corrupt, they will say, morally corrupt. That they don't follow any norms or behavior, etc. This is, a society in decay, they will say. This is where people are pretty much, experiencing degeneration, degenerates, they will call them, of course. This is a place where, of course, because there's foreigners, there's immigrants that arrive to those cities in search for work. This is a place that is very strange, because it's full of foreigners. They speak different languages. They bring, strange ideas, strange religions, and strange customs. And so it was fear of the unknown, by the way. Again, if you're very conservative, very attached to a particular way of life, the city was now a place that was really breaking out all up. Again, that there's people of all parts of the world, and this is a very fearful place, therefore, because, again, you don't know those people, in other words. You don't know what their intentions are, etc. There's a mistrust of city dwellers. And of course, the cities was also a place of where people actually pretty much create their own religions. They don't follow necessarily their Protestant religions of the past. They move to the city and they reform themselves. They adopt or absorb different practices of other religions. It's called religious modernism. In other words, religious modernism, in that they're abandoning Christianity because what they practice is no longer Christianity, it's something else, in other words, Maybe they worship a little bit of Christianity mixed with science. Okay. Or they believe now in foreign gods because there's the presence of foreigners with foreign faiths, foreign religions, and people begin to mix, a lot of those religions, and make their own. So that was also, again, something that people, conservative Texans are very, very much fearful about. This is a place where you see organized crimes. There's organized crime like gangs, for example, or there are bosses there that control, for example, liquor or prostitution and the like, the underworld, in other words. And of course, another issue that was very troubling for Texas during this time is that the city was also a place in which women were behaving in a very liberal manner. Okay, dressing with short skirts, they were going to dances and smoking and drinking and, engaging in very loose types of intimate relationships with strangers, etc. That, again, this was, horrifying for a conservative setting, again, that the city was really a center for vices. Again, vices, that there were people that were lost, again, totally morally, religiously, spiritually, that people were simply now behaving, again, in ways that were not consistent with the ethics of Christianity. In other words, you need to be a good Christian, family values, be a good role model to your children, for example. Now, that's important. And as a result of that, we're going to see that by 1920, we're going to see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, okay, the KKK in Texas. The Ku Klux Klan actually arrives to Texas and is beginning to now grow precisely from the changes that I just discussed. The disintegration of the traditional family, the migrations to the cities, and the cities becoming now more and more a place of what they call sin and crime, in other words. So in Texas, again, the KKK promoted certain ideas they believed were traditional, in other words, traditional conservative ideals that were going to save Texas society. And nationwide, again, the KKK also promoted those ideas to save American society as well. But again, they promoted those conservative ideas to return to this idealized past. In other words, we need to return to this ideal existence, okay, in which, again, we had a specific culture. We had a specific setting that they romanticized about that was far more secure for them. That is to say, again, people were patriotic, for example, love for nation, love for country, in other words, and you need to love your country. And of course, what that meant is that there were a lot of people that were not loving their country because they were immigrants, in other words, foreigners. So in other words, what patriotism is really is like nativism. People that were Native Americans were actually better, because they were born in the United States. They loved their country, in other words, as opposed to somebody that was born somewhere else. Women's purity. Women need to be pure. They need to dress in a very conservative way. They need to behave appropriately, not drink, not smoke, not to dance, not to engage in gambling, etc. All of that, women's purity, white supremacy as well. So again, they were really seeing the demographics of the state changing dramatically with immigration. And they feared that the social makeup of Texas was really changing as a result of immigrants, again, coming from different parts of the world, particularly, again, from Mexico in this case. Okay. And of course, law and order as well. They really wanted, again, order in society, law-abiding citizens, etc. Very conservative. It's a very conservative organization. But the KKK, of course, was not just trying to promote, like a political party, certain ideas so people can say, okay, look, we're going to actually listen to conferences and, kind of be informed about what we need to do. But rather, they were carrying out what is called extra-legal activities. Again, in Texas, extra-legal activities is a euphemism, again, for criminal activities. Okay, so extra legal because they were not legal. In other words, outside of the law, like for example, murdering abortion doctors. Okay, common. Okay, in Texas, businessmen abusing women. There were news that there was a businessman that had abused women in a transaction, in a commercial transaction. They will go harass that individual and sometimes murder the individual. Husbands abandoning wives. Okay, so they knew that there was a husband that just abandoned the wife, because he was womanizing or left the family, etc. Remember, there was something, sometimes the husbands had to leave to the city. Okay, they had to migrate in search for work. But in many cases, those husbands were, never returning, or there was no news of them. They were just left the family altogether. So there was many instances of that as well. Okay, and so they were also target as well. Oil union leaders. Oil union leaders, again, were also part of the, targets of the KKK in the cities. Pimps, gamblers, prostitutes, bootleggers. Bootleggers are people that traffic alcohol as well. Okay, so again, there were like a sort of street police, if you will, vigilantes that were pretty much trying to create, a more conservative setting. And they were, of course, using force. In terms of elections, they use, of course, voter intimidation as well to intimidate Republicans or populists or African Americans. Okay. And in many cases, they carried out what's called lynchings as well. Lynchings in Texas were, very common, as well as in other southern states as well. Okay. So the KKK also promoted, what is called religious fundamentalism and conformity. In other words, they use also religion, Protestantism, to promote certain ideas that go back to really the Old Testament, the fundamentals of the Bible, the essentials, in other words, the essential ideas of the Bible that talk about obedience, for example, obedience to the Father, obedience to the state, for example, obedience to, your elders, your betters, and so on, so forth, conformity. This is what the Bible calls for. God's law has to be obeyed. Again, to create a good republic, again, a very conservative, well-mannered citizenry. What we need to do is to be law-abiding, but also to abide by the commandments, to abide by what the pastor says, your minister says. We need to go to church and, conform to the rules of society, but particularly the rules of the Bible, in other words. Okay. So again, a lot of religious figures were part of, again, this particular organization, as a matter of fact, and they use the pulpit, they use the church in order to promote those ideas, again, in order to create this conservative setting that they were so desperate to restore, because they felt that this order, again, this social order, was changing dramatically, but not really for the better, but people felt dislocated and disintegrated as well. Okay, so all right, so we still have time. All right, so let's look at some other factors. I mean, we're looking at the background, again, of Texas in the 1910s and 20s. What Texas is going through that led people to see that certain change, certain reform was vital and needed, that led to the progressive era. Okay. So another issue, again, that Texas faced, as well as the rest of the country, by the way, is the issue of what is called economic monopolies. Okay. Economic monopolies. So what do we mean about this? All right. So, economic monopolies is simply, again, that in the late 19th century and the very first decades of the 20th century, there were certain companies that pretty much dominated an entire industry. Okay, that's what a monopoly is. Okay, and so we see the rise of monopolies. There were several types of monopolies, by the way. Okay, so, because there were several types of industries that were largely dominated, either directly or indirectly, by certain companies. So one single company dominated an entire industry. For example, the steel industry. Okay, steel production or the steel industry was dominated by one industry. That's just an example. Again, so in Texas, of course, what we see is that people complain about this, of course, because the issue with monopolies is that, first and foremost, well, one company pretty much deprives the rest of the citizens from participating, in the economy, because when one company pretty much seizes control of an entire industry, there's no competition. Okay, there's no competition. There's only one supplier, one provider of a product, for example, or a service for that matter. And because when you have that, when there's no competition, because there's only one source where you can actually get the steel or whatever product it is that there's a monopoly of, then the quality decreases. In other words, that this really degrades the quality, again, of what is generated because there's no competition. Okay, there's no competition. So if you have no competition, why would you improve the quality of your product? You have no other one that can actually offer a better quality. So you're not going to improve, you're not going to strive to produce a product of greater quality, for clients to actually be happy about, so they can actually be given, a product that will be durable, for example, that is going to be safe for its use, etc., because you just don't have competition. Okay, so economic monopolies curtail what is called quality and competition. Okay, the quality of products and materials that are being generated by those monopolies are low grade. They're very low grade quality, in other words. And monopolies also pretty much block competition in a way that in itself pretty much ends up breaking up what is called the spirit of free enterprise of capitalism. In other words, that there should be free enterprise, that individuals should be free to buy property and create different types of enterprises because there's no restrictions. And what monopolies are doing is really ending this idea of free enterprise, because there's no longer a free enterprise. There's only one. Okay. So if you want to preserve capitalism, therefore, the spirit of capitalism, of free enterprise, is essential to break up monopolies, to allow for individuals to compete for manufacturing or producing the same product that the monopolies produce. And when that happens, when you have competition, when you have a multiplicity of sources and suppliers and industries that produce the same product, they're going to have to actually improve the quality of the product because they're competing, and they're going to also lower their price. They lower the price because they're competing for clients. Okay. So the prices are also going to come down when there's competition. When there's no competition, the monopolies can just say, well, because nobody else is selling this, so therefore I'm actually going to fix prices at high rates because there's no other one actually that can offer that. So they all have to buy it from me. So by default, people will have to buy at the prices that the monopoly pretty much dictates. So this is the issue. That economic monopolies, of course, are threatening really the fabric of capitalism, in that people want, of course, a system of free enterprise to create a multiplicity of industries that can compete with one another, better the quality, lower the price, and this is essential to save capitalism. So again, this is something that is really, concerning all over the country. And of course, the middle class also, what they want is for break up monopolies in the country to allow not only the creation of different industries or different companies that will offer the same product, but also that those companies will actually allow the public to invest, to own a share of those companies as well. It's called investment, in other words. So monopolies are pretty much owned, by a group of people, perhaps one, two, or maybe 3 or 5 individuals. They own, again, the monopoly, that is to say. But when you break them up and you allow the emergence of different companies, what that is going to lead to is that those companies will invite the public to invest, again, in the generation of that enterprise. And if you invest in a company, they'll sell you a share. In other words, you're going to be owning a share of that company because you invested in that company, and you're going to also be paid whenever the company earns profits. You're going to be paid a share of the profits as well. So it's really, again, something that the middle class, particularly the middle class in the country, the middle class in Texas, is seeking is really, they want investment. They want to invest in industries. They want to invest in the economy, but monopolies prevent people from actually investing and participating in the success of capitalist industries. There's a multiplicity of different industries arising in the country, but again, they're pretty much monopolizing an entire industry. In Texas, for example, the Texas monopolies were the railroads. They're pretty much now coming together, even though there's a multiplicity of different companies, that in reality, when you look at their stock holdings, in other words, that they are, all of them, for the most part, are owned by a handful of individuals. In other words, it's a monopoly. Okay, it's a monopoly because despite the fact that there's different companies that they all have joint investments, in other words, joint stock, that the owners, again, of each of those companies are pretty much the same people, in other words. The insurance companies are also a monopoly in Texas as well, and of course the oil industry as well. In Texas, despite the fact that you have different oil companies, once again, when you look at the stock at the very top, the ownership, that is to say, they're owned by Standard Oil, again, of New Jersey, the Standard Oil Company. So again, it's a monopoly as well. So again, there's another issue that the peoples of Texas in the early 20th century see that this is also, again, something that needed to be reformed, okay? Because we now see the giants, they said, the monopolies on the rise. And they're preventing people from participating in the economy again as well, okay? So again, the last issue that affected the state of Texas, and that was a source of concern, particularly for the peoples of South Texas, most particularly, is what is called border violence. Okay, because in 1910, okay, in Mexico, what we see is a revolution. Now, this is the Mexican Revolution of 1910. We're not going to get into the specifics here. It's extremely interesting, by the way, to study the Mexican Revolution and how that really affected the state of Texas. And that will perhaps be assessed in a different time. It's extremely, again, very interesting, very important to actually study the Mexican Revolution and its effect on Texas. But one of the effects, again, that the Mexican Revolution had, it was really a revolution, a democratic revolution in which the dictator of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power for 34 years, in power. By 1910, he wanted to continue ruling Mexico. He pretty much staged national elections. He said he won the elections, and people just rose up against him, altogether. And as they ousted Diaz from power, there was a vacuum of power in Mexico, that several factions, several warring factions, several groups began to fight with one another. So that turned into a civil war, actually. There were 5 groups that were trying to seize control of the state of Mexico after the president had been removed. And again, this whole Mexican Revolution was really, again, a civil war actually spanned for about 10 years from 1910 to 1920. And so one of the consequences, again, is that there are several groups fighting for the control of the state. And many of the revolutionaries, the insurgents, particularly the northern groups, there were several northern groups. There were at least 3 different groups in the north. They were actually importing arms and supplies from U.S. merchants. Okay? So there's going to be that kind of issue again in the Mexican Revolution, that there was, of course, arms, supplies, etc., that were actually sold again to the insurgents in Mexico from Texas. Again, we're going to see this process unfolding. And in many cases, what happens is that the revolutionaries crossed the border. They moved into Texas territory in order to raid ranches and farms, to steal cattle, to steal crops, and so on, because they were starving. They needed to supply their own troops, their own forces, and they often actually came to Texas to actually, again, raid on property, private property, and they will be stealing cattle and the like. So there was a lot of border violence, again, during this time. That's another issue that people feared, during this time, that the Mexican Revolution was actually spilling over into Texas. It was actually, in certain senses, affecting the border region. Okay, that's another issue. Okay, so at any rate, out of all this is very important, this historical background of what was really going on in Texas in the early decades of the 20th century. So now let's look at this movement that we're going to see on the rise again from 1900 to 1920. What we're going to see all over the country and in Texas is a movement called the progressive movement. Progressivism is a social reform movement in which the participants wanted to bring about what is called social progress. The idea that we can actually create this ideal society in which the institutions, the political institutions, the economic institutions are going to be serving the people in a way that people will, if they work at it, if they discipline themselves, that there will be the possibility, the opportunity will be presented to them so they can actually attain progress in all levels. In other words, social progress. They wanted social progress, this progress of all society. In other words, okay, this is a movement that was actually led by a coalition, an alliance of different forces or groups, particularly urban professionals. Those were people living in the cities, the professional class. Many of them were intellectuals, scientists, researchers, writers, who reached out to the agrarian sector. Farmers, for example. Farmers are also going to come along to join forces with those urban professionals, as well with social reformers as well. These were, people that were idealists in the United States, that really saw themselves as living in an important time to reform American society. So they were social reformers. They wanted to reform everything that was wrong. In other words, whether it was education or the prison system, they wanted to reform the economy, companies, the workplace, you name it. Okay, they really were looking at the whole, like an X-ray again of the social body of the country, and they really identify all of the ills, again, all of the malfunctions, if you will, of society, and they really wanted to fix everything. In other words, the social reformers. Okay, those were known as the progressives. Okay, they wanted to reform the more modern institutions. They wanted to reform the political institutions, the democratic institutions, the electoral system, for example. They wanted to reform the economic system, industries. They wanted to reform the capitalist system so it would become more humane and more responsive to human pain, to human suffering, to human need. In other words, that the institutions will actually serve, in other words, human beings, so they can actually reform society as a whole. So if we reform the institutions, the institutions are going to serve, of course, the needs of the people. They're going to be more compassionate. They're going to actually address the pain, the suffering of people. We need to actually listen to what people are saying, in other words. So the institutions have to respond to those petitions, to that demand, if you will, that people demand change. So the institutions will have to actually address that. So we need to actually turn our institutions more moral, in other words, so they can be more moral, in other words. So again, so what we're going to see here is that the progressives, what exactly they wanted to accomplish here is that they wanted to improve, first and foremost, the life of the farmers, improve rural life, okay? Because they saw that farmers were experiencing enormous difficulties. Many of them were becoming tenant farmers. Many of them were migrating to the cities. Their families being disintegrated. They were losing their own properties in the process. So they wanted to improve those conditions. So farmers could actually stay in the farm if they wanted to stay, okay, if that was their choice. And so they could actually succeed to have equipment, so they could have finance, so they can have the opportunities actually to succeed in their farms, in business, and not migrate, not be forced to migrate to the city, for example, to have rural education, schools nearby to educate their children so they can have scientific training for agriculture and the like. Again, those what the progressives wanted. They wanted to end political corruption as well. Okay, they want to end political corruption and bring about, for example, the secret ballot. Okay, secret ballot. Look, what we need is voting to be secret. Okay, so that in itself is going to open the doors for the civilian population, for voters, to actually elect candidates based on merit, the merit system, based on merit. That is to say that if you're not pressured because you're being observed, you're being supervised, so you have to vote for the candidate that you're supposed to vote. When you're not pressured, you're not coerced to vote for anybody. You're going to choose somebody that you feel is most qualified. In other words, that people will actually be allowed to consider the qualities of the candidate. Are they educated? Do they have experience? Do they have honesty and integrity, for example? Those are good qualities that we need to look at, for example. Okay, I don't have to vote for the candidate of the city that the boss appointed, but rather now I have options. So this is very important, the secret ballot. Okay, they also want to purify the social institutions. The social institutions, for example, dismantle the salons, or the saloon as they're called, those taverns or pubs or bars, if you will, in which there's gambling, there's violence, alcoholism, prostitution. One way to do that, they said, is abolishing alcohol, the sale of alcohol, called prohibition. Okay, and people will, by default, again, when you abolish alcohol, will have to go sober, cold turkey, and that will allow people to actually focus again on things like education and work and family, etc. Because we cannot progress as a society, okay, when we have, of course, all of those vices, okay, where people are actually spending all of their wages, all of their monies goes in gambling, goes in alcohol, etc. And they go back home and there's domestic violence, by the way, because they're drunk, they have lost all their incomes, they have a fight again with the spouse, and there's domestic violence, of course. So we need to actually, purify our social institutions by doing that again. And also we need to purify our our prisons to reform them as well. Our education system. We need to implement what is called social welfare as well, to provide assistance again to the needy, to the underprivileged as well. And another issue that the progressives also focused was on things like suffrage, granting, women the right to vote. That's women's suffrage, that is to say. That is, again, the kind of the general, if you will, ideology, the general philosophy of the progressives nationwide. Okay, nationwide. Now, let's look at progressivism in Texas. In other words, okay, so now that we understand that there's now a progressive movement on the rise nationwide, so what happened actually in Texas? What was accomplished by the progressives? In other words, there's a need for reform. As a matter of fact, people identify, corruption in the political system. For example, we already talked about that. Things like monopolies as well. There's border violence and so on. So how is it that in Texas, we're going to see, of course, the rise of a progressive movement, and what kind of accomplishments, what kind of reforms the progressives were able to carry out, they were able to implement. Again, how did Texas change? In other words, during the progressive era, how Texas became a progressive society. All right, so let's look at that. And the way to understand that is, first and foremost, by understanding first and foremost that most of the progressives in Texas are coming out of the Democratic Party. Once again, there's a certain wing within the Democratic Party that were the progressives, that they were not really that conservative, but rather they're like left-wing sort of Democrats. They were known as the progressives. And it is this wing, this progressive wing, if you will, that are going to carry out or push forward a series of reforms that they believe were going to create a better society. Now, of course, the ideas that I just discussed a moment ago are ideas that were the general ideas nationwide of the progressive era. But the progressive ideology, the progressive philosophy, changed from state to state. Every state had their unique take of the progressive philosophy. And the progressive reforms that each state implemented were unique, were very distinct, because those were ideas or reforms that appeal to the culture of the state, in other words. So Texas was unique as well. So in Texas, the progressive ideas that those progressive Democrats tried to carry out, again, were ideas that reflected, if you will, the cultural mindset, the cultural values of Texas, in which, of course, is in the South. And because Texas was part of the Confederacy, it had still a culture very much dominated by this, again, ideology centered on what is called a white democratic society. Okay, so it was not like the populists. Like the populists were more racially inclusive. They appealed to minorities, because they were more class-based, based on class. But the progressive movement in Texas was different from the populist in many regards, because they want to create the ideal society. It's true. They want to create a more democratic society, politically and economically, but in a way that, again, is going to still retain the kind of conservative ideas of the past, this, again, white democratic society. Okay, so in Texas, again, progressivism, the progressives in Texas were individuals that were rejecting, okay, and criticizing the anti-Eastern establishment. That is to say, the Eastern Seaboard. They were very distrustful of the Eastern Seaboard, particularly the Northeast, in other words. New York, for example, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. They saw that those places were the home base of big business, in other words. Okay, the large corporations of the country. So they had a bias. In other words, in Texas, the progressives were anti-Eastern, anti-corporate establishment. That's their bias. In other words, they see that, well, the way to create this ideal society in Texas is by pretty much curtailing the influence of the Eastern Seaboard special interests. Again, those large corporations that are now in Texas, for example. Okay, so curbing corporate influence and political domination by conservative elites as well. Okay, so that's another issue again. They wanted to curtail or curb the influence of big business, many of whom were really coming from the Northeast, that were dominating now the politics in Texas, that those very conservative interest groups were now in control of the political institutions, and they were now making sure that the economic order in Texas were serving, subservient to those corporate interests, those conservative interests, if you will. Okay, so this is how Texas perceives, of course, the progressives. Texas progressives perceive, again, the state. Again, this is what the mindset of Texas progressive, again, is moving again. So therefore, many of the reforms that they're going to implement starting around 1900, 1902, were reforms that were trying to address particularly the political corruption, the economic monopolies, and the like, in order for Texas to be more and more in control of their own destinies. So peoples from Texas that were coming from a specific background, that they'll be gaining more and more control, again, of the economy and of the political system as well. For example, electoral reform. Okay, first and foremost, this is the first progressive reform, electoral reform. They want to reform, the electoral process to eliminate what they call fraud, to eliminate what is called clientelism as well. Okay, so in order to do that, they introduced something called the poll tax of 1902. The poll tax of 1902 is voter registration. You need to register to vote, but at the time that you register to vote, you need to pay a poll tax. Okay, there's going to be monies to be paid, and it was a high price. So that really prevented people from, committing fraud and voting, in several places, because now you need to be registered, and you can only vote in a specific district, in a specific place, in other words, and you need to show your voter registration. That will have to be stamped or sealed or marked, again, that you already voted, in other words. But the issue is that it costs money. Okay, it costs money, so you need to pay. It's a poll tax, in other words. It costs money to register, to get that registration, that is to say. And so what that meant is that, people that didn't have money, like, for example, the African American, of course, voters that were Republican, or the populist poor whites as well, they would not be able, again, to vote because that was so expensive. In other words, it's so expensive to register to vote, voter registration, because you need to pay, that many people just didn't have the money. Or if they did have money, they'd rather spend that money on some other, important expenses. So what that did is that people that were using clientelism, appealing to the poor, to the underprivileged for votes, that this idea that you can actually just gain, the votes of minorities or the poor people, because you promise something in return, you're going to give them something in return. That again, that is going to now come to an end, because now the poor will have to actually pay money to just vote. In other words, it's a poll tax. Okay. So they're pretty much, again, it's quite undemocratic, by the way. It's not very democratic. But the reform, entailed really doing away with corrupt practices like buying votes. That you were using voters as clients, that you will be paying them for your vote, in other words, for the votes that they're going to cast for you, in other words. The other electoral law was the Terrell Election Law of 1905. Okay, in this election law of 1905, what we're going to see is the introduction of primaries, of course, primary elections, that instead of the political boss selecting the candidate that was going to run for office, at the local level, the city, etc., doesn't matter. That now there's going to be primaries, okay, that people will have to vote. In other words, people in a locality will have to attend, a meeting, a convention in order to elect the candidate that they wanted to run for office. So it's not going to now be the political boss making those appointments, but now to primaries, it is really the people actually that are intended to choose now, of course, those candidates. Okay, so that's again something that Texas is doing in terms of trying to create a more progressive, society, and more democratic. But in reality, once again, those reforms are just making sure that the conservative wing of the Democratic Party is going to remain in control of the state, not the Republicans or minorities, etc. So again, so it sent mixed signals in many cases. Those reforms that they were not really, they were trying to save democracy, but in reality they were undemocratic. So the other reforms were the tax reforms. In 1905, there were taxes that were passed in 1905 in the state of Texas to tax corporations on their assets, corporate assets, and also their capital investments. So if corporations own lands or warehouses and they have investments in different companies, then they're going to have to pay taxes again, particularly in those assets. Whatever property they own that are not necessarily directly tied to the industry itself, but that they have investments. If they have stock, for example, if they have bought shares in other companies, then they will have to pay taxes on those investments as well. Okay. In 1904, there's also a constitutional amendment in Texas to start chartering more and more state banks for the state of Texas to have their own banks that were not necessarily be dependent upon, out-of-state banks or national banks, that Texas was going to have its own state banks. 500 banks were chartered, okay, through this constitutional amendment. And that was considered a major gain because now instead of finance being so monopolized by, out-of-state interest, that we're going to see now the flourishing of more state-based banks, in other words, from people from Texas actually opening up their own firms, their own financial firms, okay? And that was considered progressive because, again, it's trying to, pretty much break those monopolistic practices that were on the rise. Okay. Number three, other legislation that was considered progressive, again, were the antitrust legislation or antitrust laws as well. Okay. What a trust is a monopoly, by the way. When it talks a trust. Okay. So when you hear or read that term, okay, trust is actually monopoly. A monopoly during this time, again, there were a series of monopolies that were known as the big trusts. In other words, the big trust. They were known as trusts because those were actually companies that were given a trust. In other words, the state chartered them to commission that particular company to build an industry, whether it was the steel industry or the railroad industry. And they were given a lot of subsidies. They were given land grants. They were given financial assistance and the like in order to develop those industries, because they were essential. They were needed in the economy. But so they gained a trust. They were trusted, in other words, by the state. But as they received so much land and so much subsidy, so much assistance from the state, they grew disproportionately to the point that they ended up pretty much monopolizing that entire industry. Okay, that they control pretty much all the activities, all the operations of that industry. Those were known as the trust, the big trust, those monopolies. So there were antitrust laws, again, that were now implemented in the late 1890s. From the late 1890s, we're going to see in the state of Texas now, the state of Texas trying to break up the trust. In other words, the laws from 1889 to 1903, there was a series of antitrust laws, again, that restricted trust in Texas. In other words, Texas was trying to make it illegal, again, for companies to monopolize an entire industry. Okay, that is illegal in the state of Texas under those state laws. Again, the state laws of 1889 to 1903. Okay, those actually laws were actually used to go against, for example, certain companies that were creating a monopoly in Texas, like the Walter Spears Oil Company, for example, that appeared to be an independent, pretty much, oil company that was not part of this larger national oil industry, the Standard Oil, when in fact, after investigations and lawsuits, it was revealed that this company was actually owned by Standard Oil, because 3,000 shares of this company, again, were owned by Standard Oil. So in fact, this oil company in Texas was actually owned by this larger monopoly, Standard Oil. Again, so there was, again, a confrontation, a lawsuit, again, in Texas. Texas is trying to break up, again, those monopolies. In 1907, we're going to see another antitrust law, okay, called the Robertson Insurance Law of 1907. That called for insurance companies to invest 75% of all the paid premiums that citizens of Texas paid for insurance, for those insurance companies to invest that money in real estate and securities in Texas. In other words, you need to invest 75% of all your paid premiums, again, in real estate, Texas real estate, in other words, and also in securities. In other words, invest in Texas industries, invest, buy stock. That's called securities. You have to buy stock, again, from Texas industries in order to foster the development of an industry, again, in Texas. In other words, you need to invest monies in the state, in other words, okay, not just keep the profits and invest it somewhere else. You have to invest it in the state of Texas as well, okay, and return back to the community something, again, from that you gain from the state. And of course, in 1909, you got the Bank Deposit Guarantee Act of 1909 that protected people, from their bank deposits. In other words, the Bank Deposit Guarantee Act of 1909 was an insurance, if you will, that the people that had savings accounts in banks are going to actually have an insurance on those deposits, that in case a bank will close for any reason, that bank was not going to actually seize your savings and go away, but there will be an insurance, that there will be, of course, a portion of your savings that will be returned to you by that insurance, that is to say. Okay, so to protect the customer, to protect those people, again, the clients of the financial system. Education reforms. Okay, we got a series of education reforms. For example, the education system of Texas introduced, for example, standardized education. Okay, for example, look, we have to create more schools, but make sure that we have standard education, same classes, same textbooks, the same requirements, again, in the administration, the same requirements for teachers and the like, to make it standard. In other words, in 1914, the state of Texas introduced something, the compulsory school attendance law of 1914. So what it did is that it made school, compulsory, meaning that you have to attend. Children ages 8 to 14 will have to attend by 1914, 100 days, okay, from the year to school. By the 1920s, it was about 156 days out of the year that they have to be in school again. So it's increasing the number of days. This is by law now, to raise the literacy level of the population. It's a constitutional amendment as well in 1918 for the state to provide free textbooks. Okay, so it's really an amendment in the Texas Constitution that says now the state is going to provide free textbooks in public education. Okay, introducing things like teacher certification as well. Okay, teachers will have to get certified. There's a Texas State Teacher Association that now demands that all teachers in the public education system receive certification. You have to get a degree in education and also pass the exam for certification. So only certified teachers can teach And this is doing away with people that had no previous training in the past. Charter universities for education were created as well, like Sulwas State University, Stephen F. Austin, and East Texas University. All those universities really created programs for education as well. Okay, education. The expansion of colleges and universities. We got the community college movement, the junior college movement, again, in the progressive era. Junior colleges to welcome people of all ages again in the college, so they can be now receiving training, receiving education as well. The chartering of a number of new technical and private universities that offer business degrees, also education programs and certifications, engineering, in pharmacy. This was necessary to create a progressive society. And of course, institutional reforms as well. The institutions were also reformed, like the prison system. We're going to see the elimination of what is called the contract lease system. In other words, that, prisons cannot really now lease their prisoners to private enterprises to rent the labor. It mandated sex segregation as well, separating, of course, women and men, of course, in jails, and also prison sanitation and medical services. They have to meet certain standards. Again, the prisons cannot be unsanitary, in other words, have to be also clean, and also medical services provided to them. And the prison system, we're going to see also, of course, state juvenile training schools as well. Okay, reform and education for young inmates. Okay, so again, the youth that ended up in a juvenile center, they're now going to be educated. In other words, there will be classes that they can take, etc. They can receive certification, diplomas, and the like. So actually, to receive true reform. In 1911, there were the county poorhouses. This is another very important institution, the creation of hospitals and asylums for for the underprivileged, for the homeless, to actually receive medical assistance or mental assistance or therapies, etc. Again, in the state of Texas. Again, so Texas is really moving now into this new type of society, a progressive society. Women's suffrage. There's a women's right to vote. There's a Texas Women's Suffrage Association founded in 1903 that call for the women right to vote. So as early as 1903, there's already women organizing taking place in the state of Texas, that by 1918, there was a certain change that allowed actually women the right to participate in primaries, again, in the state of Texas. Okay, in the state of Texas, we're going to see now women, again, participating in primaries as well, trying to choose their candidates that will run for office as well by 1918. Of course, by 1920, nationwide, women earned the right to vote. In the U.S. Constitution, by 1920, we're going to see now women, of course, earning the right to vote. But we see in Texas, there were intense efforts for women to actually earn that as well. Finally, the last reform is prohibition. The prohibition of alcohol, of course, was necessary to really prevent the corruption of a democratic society. Alcohol was considered an obstacle for people being disciplined at work because of the hangovers, etc. And of course, the saloons corrupted also not only the citizens of Texas, but also U.S. servicemen. That many U.S. servicemen actually went to the saloons and they got corrupted there because of the prostitution and the like again. So there was a push to actually prohibit alcohol in Texas, although not all, again, the members of Texas wanted prohibition. There were the anti-prohibitionists, the ethnic minorities, again, and urban dwellers, like Germans, for example, Mexican Americans, and liberals did not want to see the end of alcohol. Yeah. So there was really a push against prohibition because some, people just said, well, this is people's choice. It should be people's decision whether they want to drink or not. In 1903, of course, we see that in 1903 and 1907, there's associations like the Texas Local Option Association and also the Anti-Saloon League of 1907 that were trying to push for dry laws in North Texas. And they really wanted, again, to eliminate all alcohol from all the counties of North Texas altogether. Although they faced, of course, opposition from another association called the Texas Brewers Association of 1901. Again, so the Texas Brewers Association, again, was pretty much against prohibition, that they lobbied, members of Congress to really prevent the prohibition of alcohol in the Constitution. They lobbied heavily, in other words, the Texas Brewers Association. The urbanites, once again, people living in the urban centers that were liberal, also in the south of Texas, Mexican Americans as well as Germans were pretty much supporting the wet laws, as they're called, again. So again, this was a big issue in Texas, but finally the issue was resolved in 1920 with the passing of the 18th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution that prohibited alcohol nationwide. Okay, and with that, of course, Texas now goes dry as a result of the 18th Amendment. And with that, of course, we conclude our discussion of the Progressive Era. When we come back in session 3, we're going to talk about Texas in the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939. This is going to be another moment of crisis and another moment of reform, something that we're going to actually pay attention very closely when we come back in session 3. But for now, this is the end, once again, of session 2 that looked at the Progressive Era. We looked at all the background, the problems of Texas society, and how people were trying to address those problems through reform. We have already outlined, again, the major reforms that Texas went through. So when we come back, now we move into the Great Depression in session 3. Thank you.